Okay, good morning everyone and welcome to the latest think tank in our series. I think it's safe to say that this time last year when IR35 reforms were delayed due to the COVID pandemic kind of initially starting, we wouldn't need to be having this discussion a year on. However, today we're going to look at how COVID might be changing working practices for industry and consequent effect on that on IR35 and contract roles moving forwards and the determinations that need to be made. Join with me today, we have our expert panel and our guests, and we're going to be discussing all things working practices. So I was going to start today by just moving through the key topic areas on IR35 determinations, and perhaps you could all input into that as to how you think the working practices are going to affect, and most importantly, how end clients, agencies and contractors can all be protecting themselves on their determinations to make sure that these kind of interim adjustments to working practices, hopefully, but possibly not, will need to be reflected in the way they continue to work, the status determinations, and making sure they remain IR35 compliant. And clearly, we think that a lot of contract roles are typically remote working, but with a wholesale remote working policy being implemented for the vast majority of companies across the UK, where do we think that this is affecting the status determinations? Carla, perhaps I can come to you first for your thoughts on that.
Well, I think that remote working is probably the most significant impact from the pandemic with respect to IR35, and probably the most important one. I think it is helpful from an IR35 perspective to be working from home, because obviously it's less likely you're going to be under the supervision, direction, and control of a client if you are not sitting right next to them. Obviously, this has raised all sorts of issues for more junior employees of companies in terms of monitoring performance, et cetera. But for contractors, I think that remote working, most of them have been doing it anyway, but it reinforces the whole concept of autonomous working.
And so if we take that approach and we say there's remote working, does that position change when you're doing an assessment, when remote working is now the norm? Is there a heightened level of remote working that needs to happen? Or because obviously a lot of companies are going to be shifting their processes, their management lines, their hierarchy all online, as we've even been through Teams and using remote tools for managing efficiency. There's a lot of companies that you see now who have requirements for people to log on to the platform when they're working from home so that they can monitor their working hours and everything. Is there a danger of contractors being washed into inadvertently this kind of overall shift to remote working? And how can people spot that? How can they identify those potential problems? It may well be that they have no option but to go along with that, but it may in turn mean that the status determination has been changed a little bit.
Yeah, I think there are pros and cons to remote working. We've always considered it a minor factor when looking at status. I mean, for example, with many roles, the contractor has to be on site. Let's say if it's a defense establishment or a public authority, quite often, the only way you can do the job is to be on site. So it can work both ways. Pros and cons, but again, I think it's a minor issue with respect to IR35 status.
Okay, I think if we take that notion of more stick with the remote working for now, and we think, okay, so companies have had to adapt very quickly, have had to rush into place policies for home working, have had to rush into place policies for COVID. And when we're looking at part and parcel in terms of an IR35 assessment, are we being pulled into the approach of the same policies for every member of the company now? And I come back to this point around systems and processes which monitor efficiency and everything. How are people in danger of doing that? And because all of these policies have been hastily, or they've had to be hastily drafted up and implemented and monitored across the board. I certainly don't think that those policies are being drafted up in haste with a kind of strong thought of IR35 and keeping contractors separate. I wonder if you have any thoughts on that, Bernie, about how there's been that kind of amalgamation of the workforce and how that affects some of the key areas of IR35.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. I think, you know, as soon as the first lockdown was announced and everybody started working remotely, you know, companies just did what they had to do to make sure their people could work. But, you know, we know that obviously now lockdown has gone on to a greater or lesser degree for a year. Which means companies are putting more policies in place, more controls in place, more governance in place with regards to how and when their staff are working. But of course, if you have contractors that use the same entry point, you know, they have to log in via Citrix or, you know, some other type of platform that is used for, you know, security purposes, you know, when you're using a home-based Wi-Fi network, or indeed, you know, specific tools that do track how long you are working, etc. Then, you know, by definition, of course, if the contractors have to log in that way using that entry point, then they are going to be affected by those sort of governance tools that were not designed for them, but have, you know, a potentially disproportionate effect on them, because it starts to make it look like they are being treated in exactly the same way as employees. And that part and parcel issue is all about, you know, how much do you differentiate your self-employed contractors from your permanent employees? And if the argument is that, you know, the way that they access the tools in which they used to work, well, then arguably then that lack of differentiation is, you know, it becomes a problem, not necessarily a huge problem, but a problem. So I think companies are lumping contractors in with that, because they won't make special arrangements for particular entry points for, you know, individual contractors. They'll roll out policies and governance tools as a whole.
Yeah, absolutely. And so that's looking at it from a kind of, I guess, legacy point over the last year. But now we're moving into an area where the determination after the 5th of April is going to be made on the end client. And a lot of end clients are looking to make blanket policy changes to bring everyone inside IR35 to de-risk. And so there is an element of this which is allowing or perhaps or incorrectly determining a role based on the current circumstances with COVID, where they're being perhaps given more impetus to determine inside IR35 status rather than outside, which is probably the correct determination. With that in mind, come 5th of April, what should we be suggesting contractors do, or what should we be suggesting contractors look out for when we're talking specifically around supervision, direction and control for the time being, and part and parcel is what should contractors, is there other things that contractors should be rejecting? Are there things that contractors should be looking out for to stop a potential risk to the supply chain? And likewise, are there things that end clients need to be thinking about moving forward in their processes? Chris, I wonder whether you have any thoughts on that.
I was just thinking, well, the first thing that came to my mind was really looking at things like home working policies and assessments and health and safety. It's quite typical that many end clients, as Bernie was just mentioning, in terms of entry points, might just be applying the same policy to all users who access their systems to ask them to complete a health and safety assessment. Now, of course, that is something to be perhaps worried about in terms of IR35 status position, because that would be typically something that you would expect to come from an employer to an employee. So, certainly something that I'm seeing with a lot of contractors that I'm interacting with, that they're being asked to complete these assessments.
Interesting. And okay, so we should be looking out for that. We should be looking out for being pulled into similar policies. They should be looking out, well, ultimately end clients should be looking to separate, differentiate their policies between contractors and permanent staff to ensure the right determinations made, and having some consideration to that in light of COVID and the current circumstances, for sure.
I was just going to say one interesting point about part and parcels. There were often questions inserted in working practices questionnaires about whether or not you have been invited to company social events, or whether or not you use facilities at the client's premises. And obviously nobody's been invited to company social events at the moment. So they can certainly answer no to those quite confidently now. Absolutely.
And with that in mind, I'm interested myself in terms of a proper view is, does that waiting on a status determination have less impact when everyone's doing it? Or is there a kind of shift in, well, actually employees aren't going to the Christmas parties, employees aren't going to the functions, and therefore it doesn't really matter in terms of the determination?
It's just not relevant at the moment, is it?
Yeah, so when we're doing status determinations, we're looking at the relevance of the current situations as well with COVID. And I think therefore it's important to shift your weighting on your IR35 assessment when you're talking to end clients according to the current circumstances. Would that be fair?
I think so. I think the working practices questionnaires are designed to be answered in current time. So they are your current working practices.
Yeah.
But again, that, Risa, it's a minor issue when looking at the big picture, but it's a factor.
Yeah. Well, I think it's an important factor when you're assessing IR35, when you're looking at it from a flexibility standpoint to your IR35 processes, because as we always say, algorithms aren't going to be able to pick up these changes in COVID unless the algorithm is changed. A person is going to be able to assess the environment, assess the current situation for the company, assess what that company is operating, what industry that company is operating in, and therefore how these kind of events have impacts on them in terms of the general feel of the contract. So I think, yes, it may be not important or it may be a small part of the actual overall determination, but it's definitely key to be looking at it from a flexibility perspective with end clients moving forward with their assessments. Yeah. Yeah. Bernie, I think I interrupted you on something.
Oh no, I was just going to say, I think one of the difficulties that you have is a lot of people, when they're looking at assessments, they make direct comparisons between their employees and their contractors when they're looking at IR35 status. And actually, that isn't what the legislation asks you to do. It says if the intermediary, if the PSC was removed, would that individual be an employee for tax purposes? So it's not quite the same thing. What you're not saying is, what do I do with my permanent employees and what do I do with my contractors, and how are they different or not? So it isn't a direct comparison. So the fact that potentially, no company events, for example, are going on, and therefore contractors not attending them makes no difference because nobody's attending them. I don't think necessarily that's, kind of exactly right. I think the fact is that, it isn't a direct comparison between your employees and your contractors. It is looked at neutrally from a standpoint of nothing, not as a comparison against something else. I just think that's just something I would want to sort of highlight, really.
Yeah, that's a really important point. That's really valid. And I think that shows the point of a proper assessment, doesn't it, in terms of looking at it from a kind of zero position and then working out what the overall contract looks and feels like. Does it look more like a business to business relationship, or does it look more like a business to employee? Absolutely. Yeah, that's good, important point. That. So, okay, so we've looked at supervision, direction and control. I guess from a control perspective, I wouldn't expect a huge level of change in control to if the person was working in the business, was working in the company. I would expect companies to still have the same type of control and the same type of oversight over their teams, whether they're remote or in the office. What are our thoughts on that? Bernie's disagreeing with me, I think.
I mean, I don't disagree, but I do think, I do think that this unique combination of COVID and the new off-payroll rules coming into effect, I do think people are more mindful of it. And I do think that the understanding that people can work well remotely will have a long-term effect, not just when they have to, but when they have the choice either way. And I think the same thing comes from a control perspective as well, which is, if you have people, whether they are your own staff or they are contractors that you oversee the work of, in terms of outputs, etc. Well, actually, if they are doing what they need to without, any degree of intervention or minimal intervention, why would you not carry that on? I mean, one of the things that I've certainly heard in end client organizations is, some of the business units who deal with, significant numbers of contractors, what they say is the reason why I use contractors is because I have my own job to do, and managing employees takes up so much of my time and resources that I can't do my day job. Whereas using contractors means, yes, I might have a catch up with them once a week or once a month or, whatever, depending on what needs to be done. But I've got to let them be and do their own thing. And the fact that I don't have to manage them and support them and check they're all right, I don't have to do any of that stuff, which means I can do my day job. And I think those are the type of business unit owners and managers that will find that their IR35 practices going forward are much more effective, because the whole point is that they don't want to waste their own time. They don't want to use their own time to be constantly overseeing or supervising those contractors. I think that's a good thing. And then, their mind has been focused on it, particularly because of IR35. So it works to their advantage in that scenario.
That's an interesting point. I think I would agree with the vast majority of it. I'm not sure I agreed with the fact that, or certainly not the people I've been speaking to have been able to let go, I guess, is the the phrase I would say. I speak with people who have their teams. They have a Teams area on where they're on video camera all day, so that anyone can drop into a session and ask a question as if they were just sat at their desk. They have group meetings scheduled every single minute of every day so that they're on top of everything. And I think you're absolutely right, though. It comes down to the manager. Some managers love to manage, and that's their purpose, and that's what they're there to do. And some are fantastic at it, and some are way too micromanaged to be kind of effective. And some have taken this as an opportunity to just go, I'll let my team crack on, see how it goes. And if anything substantive goes wrong, then I'm here to back it up. And it's been a really interesting time, I think, from speaking to other business leaders and other organizations about how they've made this shift into remote working, and how easy it's been or how hard it's been, how frustrating it's been, and then balancing that with home life and necessary changes to well-being for staff, and all of those things are going to change. And I know we're moving significantly away from IR35 here, but I think it's an interesting point when talking about a return to work, a tentative return to work coming within the next kind of 4 or 5 months for most people. how things are going to change going forward, and whether people are going to be a little bit less or a bit more hands off and let people just crack on, or whether things are going to revert to type. And I guess that does come into IR35 practices. We have to take it into account of how things are going to go in the new world, but also we're going to have to take account of the actual specifics of the situation, i.e. the people being managed, the person managing, and the industry and the company, and how much management is going to be required. What's the same for a construction company is going to be very different to what's needed for a professional services company. So it's going to be a really interesting time to see how people adapt back to coming back in the office. And I think a lot of people have a lot of nervousness around that, and what's going to be expected of them as business leaders, what's going to be their policies and their processes, and making sure everyone's happy. So it's going to be a very interesting time.
And I think, Reese, that employers are going to have to be very careful about health and safety legislation and the Equality Act with respect to forcing people to return to the office.
Yeah.
It's not necessary. I mean, obviously, if it's an office-based role, as you say, if it's construction, then obviously you have to be on site.
Yeah.
But if it's not necessary, then employers are going to have to be very careful about insisting that someone returns to the office because of that legislation.
And I think that's an important point to cover, not for IR35 necessarily, but for a general compliance perspective, because you're absolutely right. If we've proven over the past year that work can be conducted remotely, then how do you, I guess, force is the wrong word, but create a policy where a return to work 5 days a week is mandatory, or a return to week at all is mandatory? And I think we're starting to see a lot of law firms circling now in terms of saying, well, are you being forced to go back to work? Have you been forced to work through COVID? Have you been forced to work on site? If so, speak to us, because we think you may have a claim. And that's a scary time for companies where you've got a lot of senior leaders who have worked in offices their whole life. They've worked in premises, and they think that's the right way to do business. That's the way they can have clients come in, see there's a busy office and things going on. And then you've got other members of staff who have been incredibly happy at home and have been, for a lot of people, more effective, more efficient at home. And then you've got other people that hate working from home and want to come back into the office, and you've got to try and fit all of those things together. But with the overall approach of health and safety at work and making sure you're not bringing people back in unnecessarily. So it's a very, do you have any recommendations on that, Carla, from a contract drafting perspective or from a policy perspective?
Well, I think it's an evolving piece of work for a lot of us at the moment. I mean, obviously, we're all looking at our home working policies. Some firms have put in place a temporary one, but they may need a permanent home working policy. But it's just a matter of keeping the Equality Act legislation in mind and being flexible. Yeah.
So when you're talking, can you go a little bit further on obviously the health and safety policy is clear and understood. When you're talking about the Equality Act, what do companies need to be thinking about there?
Well, there are protected categories under the Equality Act with certain people, for example, people who have caring responsibilities, people who have chronic health conditions. And of course, those type of people may be extremely concerned about returning to work. So that legislation in particular needs to be forefront in employers' minds when they're drafting these policies.
Absolutely. No, Karen, Bernie, please.
You've also got the issue, of course, that the vaccine rollout is starting with age, and age is a protected characteristic under the Equality Act as well. But not just necessarily how old you are, but the other way around as well. So actually, if the vaccinations are starting at the older end of the spectrum and working down, well, then what do you, if you then say as an employer, if you've been vaccinated, we want you back in the office, well then through no fault of your own, because of the way that the government decided to roll out the vaccinations, you're then forced to go into the office, but you're an older worker and the younger ones aren't.
Amazing, isn't it? Amazing. So much to think about there.
So many different dynamics as a result.
Yeah, it is. So yeah, lots of work for lawyers to be cracking on with and drafting. So look forward to that. Okay, so we've kind of gone off on a little bit of a tangent there, but really useful information for people coming back, and see if anyone has any questions around the return to work or wants to raise questions around what their contracts look like. Please feel free to contact any of our experts on the panel. Contact details are available on our site. So the final topic I wanted to cover in terms of a working practices side of things is financial risk. And we all know it, when the problems happen, the first lot to go are contractors. And we've certainly seen that. We've seen certainly a shedding in a very difficult period for contractors, especially compounded with a lot of PSC contractors not getting any support, financial support from the government. And we won't go into that debate today, other than to kind of point to the supporting groups that are trying to change that premise. But I think from my perspective, clearly financial risk is a big factor when, if we shut the office for an event, whatever it is, let's call it the pandemic for the time being, does that mean the contractor doesn't get paid? And invariably, I think that has been the case, or that's what we've seen, that if you can't work because the contractor, the end client is getting their systems back online, or they're trying to get a shift, it's more we'll deal with the contractors and shortly, and we'll focus on the employees for the time being. And I would assume in those instances that contractors haven't been paid for that period. And so it's going to be another factor. Wonder if anyone has any thoughts to kind of supplement that notion.
Well, I think it does reinforce the taking of financial risk, that there has been very little support for contractors. There's no doubt about it.
And through all of these things, clearly the contract speaks volumes in terms of an IR35 assessment. The working practices speaks volumes, but examples speak even greater volumes. And so when we're talking about were you substituted, or have you had an example where a substitution was created? Then if the answer is yes, then you're clearly going to be able to enforce that point around the applicability of the working practices and the contract terms. So in all of this, COVID, I'm sure, has created a series of events for people which allows them to show examples of things which have happened in their contract. Substitution is perhaps unlikely, but financial risk has probably been evidenced. Part and parcel has probably been evidenced. Place of work has probably been evidenced. A change in control has probably been evidenced. And all of these things have affected the working practices in one hit. And so I wonder whether that's now being able to provide people with examples of moving forward, and end clients and contractors and agencies in terms of the whole supply chain really need to be talking to each other to identify where those things have happened, where those events have changed the working practices, and how that now changes the determination a little bit, rather than the end client just assuming that nothing's changed, that that's the situation and that's how it is. Because ultimately, come 5th of April, we're going to start to see more contractor-led disagreements with the IR35 determinations, and those disagreements might be based on these key events that have happened. So for me, the end client and the agencies need to be taking stock of all of these things and saying, has this has this affected my contractor base? Have these things shown a greater degree of business to business relationship or a business to employee relationship? Do you guys agree with that?
Yeah, and actually I think there's another example that you can add to that as well, Reece. So there are quite a few of the contractors that I know where they might, be traveling quite far every day to go to client site, because of course, they have a skill set that is needed wherever. They're not doing that travel, and a lot of contractors now are actually able to support multiple clients simultaneously, which reinforces the independence of that contractor and the fact that they are running a business. They have multiple clients that they support simultaneously, which is really only possible when they are remote working, because they certainly can't do it while they're on client site, and frankly they're too tired after a 2-hour commute each way or whatever. So I think that's another example as well of people being able to show that because of the situation, because of the way that I now work, I'm able to show more readily that I am running my own business because I do support multiple clients simultaneously. And again, it does go back to what Carlo was saying, which is none of these are huge. None of them are huge in their own right, but there is it starts to build up a picture, if you like, and I think the thing is that when they are taken in their cumulative effect, and of course, as part of that the wider kind of all of the factors together, etc., then I do think it helps. It's just a little nudge in the right direction. It won't make the difference, I don't think, necessarily between being inside or outside, if there is a very good reason why someone is inside and that hasn't changed. But I certainly think it starts to paint a picture. And as you said, the contractual relationship is better mirroring then the working practices. And when the two of those are aligned, that is the best position that you can be in. It's where one doesn't really quite gel with the other that you start to see chinks in the armor that HMRC can come and sort of stick their finger in and wiggle around.
Absolutely. Yeah, I agree with all of that. And I think one of the things we haven't talked about with financial risk is expenses, and expenses being incurred with going to different sites, all sorts of things associated with that. But I think I've spoken to people who are based in America, and obviously with the move of everything coming online, and you see it now. I mean, celebrities, for example, and let's say take an author who would normally go and do one TV show a day and travel to it, is on Zoom now and can do 10, 15 different events in a day. And same with consultants who are helping consultancy firms. They go and do a video call with this group of leaders, they're going to do a group call with this, and they've got 5-6 sessions done in a day where they could definitely only do one given traveling, and they've got access to the world. So yeah, that's a really key point, that there's now people going to be able to take on more work, more communication. Whether or not that lasts is going to be dependent on those companies and their back to work policies. But yeah, absolutely, another clear example. And I think you've all said it in terms of the IR35 assessment. Yes, they may be small points, but perhaps not so insignificant when allowing you to evidence what is actually happening and the reality of your working practices and the reality of how your contract runs. So all things that the supply chain needs to be thinking about, I think, and something to think about moving forward. Great. Okay. Well, I think that's enough for today, unless anyone has any other points they'd like to raise, bring in. No?
I
Good.
I was just going to say, Reece, I think everything that we've been talking about this morning just highlights the need for sort of working practices to be sort of under continual assessment, really. That when it comes to making that status decision at the beginning, inside or outside, it's a measure of a situation at one point in time. And particularly now, as we're potentially starting to shift back to sort of office working, or maybe a bit of a hybrid of both, I think that just highlights that there needs to be some very close attention to working practices over the next few months, because things are going to shift around. So you can't just sort of make the assessment, file it in the drawer, and then just wait. There needs to be continual assessments. I mean, at least every 3 months, I would have thought.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that's, from a tax investigations perspective, that's the biggest area we see picked up by HMRC as well. You said working practices on day one was this. 6 months down the line, they're completely different, and the contract isn't being run in the way that anyone said it is. And that's always a problem with supply chain transparency. It's the biggest issue there, that the entities just don't talk to each other. And I genuinely do think that with agencies taking more responsibility in the chain, just that responsibility being thrust upon them by the legislation, they have a real opportunity to link everyone up in that chain and continue that conversation, so that those working practices can be discussed regularly. They do reflect the reality of the situation, and you stand less risk overall, commercial, HMRC, financial, whatever you want to look at it, but a lot less risk if you can evidence that those working practices are up to date and are relevant, and everyone in the supply chain is working to the same, banging the same drum. So I think, yeah, absolutely right. Yeah, completely agree with you there. Okay, excellent. Well, thank you as always to our panel. It's lovely to see you all. And until next week, thank you all for your time.